Hopefully I got the volume. Oh yeah, I got the volume.
Well, hello, good evening, or good almost evening, depending on where you're at. This is Comic Boom. Today we are going to talk about the legacy of crime comics, Senate hearings, censorship, and a 10-cent plague. I have with me a very special guest, Cummings of 10-Cent Story, someone who's got someone who certainly knows, who's had his own part in comic book history, played a role in some recent comic book culture debacles over the last few years, and also someone who is actually working on a thesis on the Senate hearings of the 1954 Kefauver hearings, the Senate hearings dealing with crime comics. And it just so happens, back in 1995, I did my thesis in university on crime comics from the Canadian perspective. And Cummings will be a 10-Cent Story. We'll be talking about the American hearings and Senate hearings on crime comics and the impact it has had on our culture. Cummings, tell us something about your channel and how you came about this particular topic.
Yeah, so I'm getting my history degree at university, and this is like the last, main core class that you have to take is develop, a research project and paper for your degree. And so I was pretty excited about either choosing the music industry in the 1980s, where, you had the messages in music, or, I could go over comic books. I like both those subjects. I like Ozzy Osbourne and heavy metal music, and I like comic books. So yeah, I chose comic books because I started to see like things that like challenged my personal worldview. In particular, in the comic book industry, they hate Frederic Wertham. And so I just went to, when you're starting to research a topic, you go into Wikipedia and you just start, filling your head with what's going on, generalizing, getting the general feel of what people think about a topic, because that's really what Wikipedia is. Yeah. And, Frederic Wertham helped children. He was very excited about helping children. He helped end segregation. That's kind of part of his legacy that people don't associate. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start with the comic industry here. And, I started reading about it, and it's just been really mind-blowing. You've read the whole book. I've read it up till a certain point, the 10-Cent Plague. And I would also recommend this one here, which covers national comics. It's got Bob Kane stories in it. It's got Superman story in it. You can cover all that. So the what's it called? Men of Tomorrow is a great book to cover for the Golden Age as well. I really think the reason why I've started my channel is because I look at the 10-Cent Plague, and I kind of flipped it to the 10-Cent Story, because I think comic books, the fact that almost 100% of children were reading them at that day and age, and it's seen as like the product of American culture. I think it's the American story, and that's why I've used that for my YouTube channel name.
That's it's a great name. It's a great name, and I want to give a little bit of background here, because you mentioned a couple names there for a couple of viewers that may not be familiar with it. You mentioned Frederic Wertham. Yeah. Frederic Wertham was someone that both Cummings and I are going to be talking about Frederic Wertham a lot in this live stream. Frederic Wertham wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent. It was published in...
I got it right here.
Yes. Seduction of the Innocent. Frederic Wertham, MD. He published it in 1954. And from the 1940s, just a little bit of background here. I got some stats I want to read, because when we talk to a modern day audience and we talk about how people got so excited over crime comics and how they could cause juvenile delinquency, for those who might be shocked that America could be that foolish to think that crime comics could cause juvenile delinquency, I want to give a snapshot of the statistics at that time, and I got these statistics coming from the 10-cent plague.
Yes.
From the 1940s to the 1950s, and I'm generalizing here based on a whole series of data, there was approximately 80 to 100 million copies of comic books sold every week. 80 to 100 million per week at its height. That is incredible. 35 cents.
And one thing I want to point out is these are all estimates because they didn't take real statistics. Like, they didn't count them.
That's true. That's true. It was estimated that 35 cents of every dollar at a minimum at every newsstand went toward a comic book. In 1952 alone, there were 20 different publishers in the United States, 650 titles per month, employing thousands of artists, writers, letterers, untold members of racial, ethnic, and social minorities who turned to comics because they couldn't necessarily express their ideas in other spheres of publishing or entertainment. And it's worth noting that after World War II, pulp became more available, and so they could actually have access to have more paper to create more comic books. That's exactly what they did. And when we talk about Frederic Wertham coming out of World War II, and this is where I'll segue into your comments. Maybe could you explain from your studies, Cummings, what happened that got America so riled up about comics in the first place? You know, obviously there was a lot of them, a lot of children were reading comics, but why did it cause such an uproar? What happened exactly?
Well, like you said, it was just after World War II, and people were just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, why did these wars happen? How can we stop it from occurring again? Also, you have juvenile delinquency. You know, it's this term that I thought was medical because I saw Frederic Wertham using it all the time, but it started in the legal system. So they perceived that children were committing more and more crimes. And so they're trying to understand that as well. You have to realize that the social sciences were really taking a stronghold in the 40s and the 50s and progressing on from there. So they were really trying to basically figure things out. And since comics were the main media source for children, entertainment-wise, there was no TV, there was movies, but you had to go somewhere and actually watch those. Comics, you can pick them up anywhere, any newsstand, all around the country for a nickel, sometimes even less if they were on sale.
Or
you have them.
Or 10 cents. Hence the name of the.
I said a nickel. I said. Anyways, yeah, they would sell them for a nickel as well if they were old. Yeah. And kids use these as currency to trade with one another, bartering and all this sort of stuff. So they could read more and more stories. TV wasn't around. That's what you got to realize. So comics were what kids were spending their time entertaining themselves with. And, when you have something like that, people are going to, try to figure out, if they're good, if they're bad. They're going to, like I showed you last night, you have, what was his name? Sterling North.
Yeah.
He was a novelist, and he was trying to persuade people to read books instead of comics. Yeah. Little biased, so it's really pretty interesting. There was different factions, of course, that, had their different opinions on anti-comic books. You had the Catholic Church, which you can just guess what their opinion was. Basically that there's violence, there's scantily clad people, all this sort of stuff. And they had lists of comics that they did not like, and they would send out, the do-gooders to go out and try to talk to different salespeople and try to get them to stop selling the books. You had Frederic Wertham, who, had the children in mind, and his real opinion was that he didn't want salesmen to sell children comics. He wanted legislation put in place to stop that from occurring. And basically his thought was, if adults wanted children to have comics, put it in their power and they can, decide for the children, I guess.
Yeah.
Whatever your point of view was on that. He was very anti-censorship, though, is what his view was. And then there was a lot of people that just didn't like them because they thought it was trash literature that only stupid people read, because they were against consumerism and the consumerism media that we have going on. For some reason, they felt it would lead to fascism, because you look at it and you kind of look at it as in Superman is for America and he resolves every problem with violence, and you go, I guess I can see what you're saying there. It kind of makes sense, until you kind of factor in that he was basically kind of created to go. Captain America, for example, was created to go against the Nazis. On the first issue, he's punching Hitler. But
I would add to your comments as well that I did my study was specifically on Canadian culture, but I'm sure there's a lot of commonalities with the American culture at that time. And after World War II, the focus turned from military efforts and building up a military infrastructure to people focused more on social infrastructure, and people turned inward and focused on family more. And the generation after World War II was very materialistic. Suddenly it was a very powerful economy. And when you have a more materialistic culture, you cater to your children more, and they became overprotective, and anything that could affect their children, they were ultra sensitive about, and things were heightened. And it was interesting in Canada, one of the first signs that something was happening is in the court system is that juvenile delinquents, when they were defending themselves, their parents would show up in court, and judges, more and more parents were blaming the comic books for the behavior of their children. And there's a number of judges spoke out about this. And then it reached a point in Kamloops, British Columbia, where a number of parent-teacher groups spoke up, and the member of Parliament, a man by the name of E. Fulton in Canada, he sought to amend our criminal code, and he brought this fight against crime comics, and he really thought it was important to get jury trials and have community standards set, and let each community judge what these terrible comic books are doing to our youth.
Well, it's really interesting because you have the intellectuals, and they didn't like American culture. Their stronghold is like the classics and more European culture. And so like they seen, like, for instance, this is why you have this distinct difference between newspaper and comics. The New York strips and the comic strips is their view was adults read the newspaper. So those comics are made for adults, and comics are for children. So those are for children. That's why you have that distinct difference. And they really didn't like the comics because of that reason, with all the violence and the horror and just stuff that they seen that children they believed shouldn't be reading. And it's real pretty interesting when you take all that into account. The big thing about child delinquency, though, that I wanted to point out, you can see this in A Cycle of Outrage. That's another book that I've been reading. They talk about the statistics for this crime going up. But there was a study that was done in the 50s. I'd have to go through my notes to look for it. He concluded that a lot of the things that made crime rise wasn't actually the fact that more crimes were occurring. It was because statistics were being, taken better, and police and the society going, oh, here's a problem, we need to, start looking at child delinquency. So then police actually started arresting more people for that. All that sort of stuff was making the numbers more inflated. And he said that there was probably more crime at the beginning of the 19th century than there was in like the 1940s and 1950s.
I think that's very true, because quite frankly, and that just makes sense from an economic point of view. It was a more materialistic time in the 1940s and 50s. People had generally more than what they had during the Great Depression. I mean, people have to remember that the parents of the youth of the 1940s, they were raised in the Great Depression. They weren't used to having a lot. And so when they're raising their children in the 1940s and 50s, they want to dote on their children. They want to give them the things that they never had, and they want to protect them. And frankly, it would make sense that crime wasn't proportionally that much higher than it was before. And like you said, it was the advent and the beginning of improved social sciences. And it's somewhat ironic that, as I know we've indicated before in our private discussions, where Frederic Wertham never had any empirical evidence supporting his obscene suggestions of crime causing all these problems, but nonetheless social science was in its infancy. And but I just a couple of quick comments. I note that you gave me the Harvard Law Review article, Stanford Law Review article, and I also looked at in my thesis when I was doing in the Canadian Senate hearings. One of the things that they noted is that there were intellectuals and senators that did mention all this stuff. There were people that said this is not evidence. There were people that said that. And
everybody, almost even people that agreed with Frederic Wertham, he had glowing reviews. They all attacked his scientific evidence, what he calls scientific evidence, which, to be fair, his scientific evidence was his clinical process, which was good, maybe for the children. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really comment on that. Hopefully those children, came out of that positively. But to say that then these are more than anecdotes is a little bit less. There's another woman that I want to talk about named Loretta Bender. She actually was an advisor for DC Comics at that time, called National Comics. Her name's in the comics if you can get a hold of a Golden Age issue. And she had the opposite opinion. Hers was like an Aristotle type philosophy, where if a child reads a book and it's damaging to them, they're not going to read that book anymore. But they're going to read things that they enjoy, and that's going to benefit that child, because it's going, especially one that has problems, it's going to benefit that child because it's going to, help soothe them, is what I think they said. You'd have to go read the paper. But that was really interesting. So you have, I think, personally, and this is what I'm doing with my paper, you have Frederic Wertham and you have Loretta Bender, these two experts on children with problems, basically. And they have two takes that I think actually don't even contradict, like they could both be true. And that's what I think is really interesting about it. That's what my paper is basically going to be about, the Senate hearings. Both these people testified in the Senate hearings. And my thesis is basically going to be that the Senate, the United States Senate, manipulated the people that testified into getting the comic industry to self-censor themselves so that they wouldn't have to pass laws that were unconstitutional.
And that's a wonderfully put, in a perfect segue into some comments I could make in my review of the Harvard Law and Stanford Law reviews. I found them very interesting. I'm certainly not going to.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to hear this, because I read them and because I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand them. Like, I see terms and I'm like, there's something about those terms, but I don't know the basis for them.
Well, I don't think I'm going to blow you away with anything wise necessarily. What I just my only observation is that I was impressed. Let's put it this way: everything I've always known about the Kefauver hearings that led ultimately to inspired the formation of the Comics Code Authority, I've always thought that I always had this impression that there wasn't a lot of rational thinkers, because everyone was so hell bent on thinking that, these things that crime comics cause juvenile delinquency. That wasn't the case at all. In actual fact, if reading those law reviews, the legal community knew they absolutely knew that virtually everything they would do in terms of creating new laws, even creating community standards and going to jury trials, and they knew that most of it would not withstand constitutional scrutiny. And incidentally, just a quick note, Canada never had a constitution back in the 40s. We have the British North America Act. We technically never had a constitution per se. The BNA Act was our constitution, but let's just say that we never had the first, second, we never had all the amendments and the protections the Americans had you guys had constitutionally. So that's one of the reasons why we in Canada, we actually created a new criminal code. We made crime comics illegal in Canada. And quite frankly, and incredibly enough, our courts found other unconstitutional ways to actually strike down some of it, or didn't apply some of it for reasons which I can get into later. But my point about the American experience is they looked at all the different ways that they could censor comic books, and it was amazing the detail that they went into. That you could cut off publication, you could cut off distribution, but every time, for example, one of the reasons why they didn't recommend cutting off comic book distribution was that it was very difficult to distinguish a comic book from other periodicals. And there was also shipping problems. And then there was also, it conflicted with different legislations, and it would affect state commerce. And it was hard to isolate the comic book from other modes of commercial product to ship. And it would have just...
Yeah, because it talked a lot about how writing the law, it couldn't be too vague, and how do you define, the comic book, basically.
Exactly. And then when you got into publications and going against the legislation against the retailer, all of this would likely not withstand constitutional scrutiny. And the other thing I found interesting, which I forgot, and I forget the name of it, there's some very well-known books at the time that were also banned in places like, especially in the South, by well-known authors. And so it wasn't just comic books, but it was something where like I said, they always preferred community standards. And even up here in Canada, we our MP Fulton, when he introduced Section 207 of the Criminal Code into our criminal code, when we criminalized crime comics, his preference was to always give it to the jury. And his idea was, we made it a strict liability offense. It didn't matter what the retailer didn't have a defense. The retailer didn't have the excuse of saying, but I didn't know it was a crime comic. I get 650 titles a month. I don't read all my comics. I just put them on the stand. I didn't know it was a crime comic. That was not a defense. That was not a defense in Canada. But interestingly enough, there was very, very few convictions in Canada, because quite frankly, no attorneys general ever wanted to make an issue out of it. So it was all social hype. It was a lot of hype. It really was. It reached its height in Canada, interestingly enough, in 1949 is when it was 5 years later that the American hearings were held. And our MP Fulton testified at the American hearings, and he talked about the Canadian experience. And it's very interesting if you read the transcript of that, because MP Fulton, he was treated like he was an expert, and he really wasn't. And he was treated a lot more respectfully at those hearings, at the American hearings, than guys like William Haynes, the publisher of EC Comics, was. But in any event, just to summarize, cutting right to my point, it fits in exactly with what you're saying about the reason why it makes complete sense. They didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. This had all the hallmarks of something that would go all the way to the Supreme Court. If there's no way that there was still courts in various parts of the United States that were striking down attempts to make it illegal, striking down municipal bylaws because it wouldn't stand scrutiny. And so it just made sense that, and we talked about this, and then I'll finally let you speak, to cut right to the chase. So much to say, it was the pressure from the community that got the retailer to remove them from the stand. The retailers didn't want to be stigmatized by the community. It was the
Catholic Church actually knew that was the best way to effectively get to the publishers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's funny. I've got newspaper articles here when in my thesis where there was a kid that was there was an individual that was murdered in northern BC, and it's funny when this kid was picked up as a suspect, it was actually mentioned in the paper that the police went to the kid's home and they found a comic book, and inside the comic book was a drawing of a map, and the story in the comic book was a villain had drawn a map of how he was going to rob a place, and then they compared that to the map that this kid drew up to break into this place where this guy ended up getting killed, and they somehow drew the inference that this kid these crime comics caused the kid. That's how it was working in the paper. Caused the kid to commit this crime, as if this comic book had this magical effect on the kid and sort of led to this crime. It was just outrageous. And even the judge talked about, he called it terrible stuff. We got to get rid of this stuff. And it's just.
Well, Frederic Wertham actually, he talks about that very thing. I don't know if it's the same case, but he does talk a lot about the crime comics and how they're a template for how to do crime.
Yeah.
And he does have a good the way he does kind of lay it out is pretty logical. Like the criminal basically has a load of fun until the end of the story, and then he goes to jail or he gets killed. So he would ask children, what's the moral of the story? And they would say, don't get caught. And so his argument was these crime comics aren't teaching people to be moral. They're teaching you don't get caught while breaking the law, which I thought it's a pretty good argument, actually. But we know overall that doesn't stop, people from doing crime.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm just putting up on the screen different things and propaganda. Well, I call it propaganda, but at the time it was commonplace seeing these images. And people.
There was one good thing that I wanted to point out real quick. The person that was the chairman, the Coffee, is that how you say his name? Kefauver?
Kefauver.
Kefauver. He ran for president in the late 40s. And it was failed, obviously, because Eisenhower was became president. And so he was going to use the 1954 hearing and also the TV hearings to build his base for another presidential run, which ultimately failed because Eisenhower was president, and then JFK became president, and so on and so forth. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. He really didn't want to do anything besides build people to him and his brand.
And you mentioned this before, so you mentioned the fact that this wasn't, in many ways, there were people had ulterior motives in propagating this crisis, ulterior motives. And were there any other players that had ulterior motives as well beyond Kefauver?
The first one, which that one article I showed you, Sterling Northern was a novelist. And so his opinion was to get kids away from comics and come and read my book, which he did very well. His best book, I can't remember what it's called. You could easily Google it out there, but it came in 1960 when his big work was released. Yeah. The thing to keep in mind is there was people that had their alternative motives of becoming famous and doing this and doing that. There was people that were looking out for their children, and it was just people using this movement to try to get their ultimate goals. There was a lot of people that had different goals in mind, and it wasn't something that was small.
Now, I think that's right, because and it's one of the topics I want to get to and we'll eventually talk about it, is it's very easy to draw parallels to what they were doing in the past, hyping this up, pretending that their children were so ultra sensitive. Like, so many, our children need protection from what they're reading. And of course, the children when you talk to people, there's a lot of famous writers. There's one writer in particular, Mordecai Richler. He's a famous Canadian author. He recalls growing up in the 1940s and 50s, and he's an excellent writer. And he talks about how, he remembers, reading and watching stories on and reading stories in the paper about the evil things that Americans were doing to the Japanese soldiers, and the evil things they were saying about the Japanese and the Germans. And yet his parents were so concerned about protecting him from the evils of comic books. And, he says it with a bunch of sarcasm, and it's just how everyone just became absolutely ridiculously overprotective. I want to have a little bit of fun here. This is something I'm sure this is probably one of the most, you look on the screen, probably the most famous comic book cover that was referenced at the Kefauver hearings, or Kefauver Senate hearings. Senator Kefauver held this comic book when he was cross-examining MC Gaines, the comic book he held up, crime suspense stories. On the cover is a man holding a bloody axe in one hand and a woman's head in the other. He asks him, "Is this in good taste?" he asked. "Yes," said Gaines, "for the cover of a horror comic. I think it would be in bad taste if you were holding the head a little higher so the neck would show the blood dripping from it." But Senator Kefauver goes on in a subsequent conversation. He then asks Frederic Wertham, Senator, the following question. He says, "Dr. Wertham, in some comic books, the villain made one mistake. We find some cases where they are trying to eliminate the one mistake so they can make the perfect crime." Dr. Wertham said, "Yes, that is absolutely correct. That is the whole philosophy of comic books. The point is don't make any mistakes." Senator Kefauver says, "Would you liken this situation you talk about, showing the same thing over and over again until they finally believe it, to what we heard during the last war of Hitler's theory of telling the same story over and over again? The big lie technique?" Dr. Wertham, "Well, I hate to say that, Senator, but I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They get the children much younger. They teach them race hatred at the age of 4 before they can even read." But
because there was racial epithets in a lot of comic books and stuff like that. And his point was, a lot of these children that are 5, 6 don't know how to read very well, but they'll know the curse words and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting to point some of that stuff out, but Hitler was the comic book industry is worse than Hitler. It shows you how good Frederic Wertham is at rhetoric, and when you read it, it's not as convincing. But one thing that I noticed when I read one of the books was they pointed out, because I really think that Gaines's argument is a lot better on paper. Yeah. But apparently, Frederic Wertham was very charismatic during the hearings. And Gaines, like, everybody was in shock and awe of, like, how dare he, sort of thing.
Well, I think that's a good point, because I showed this to you as well. If I looked at reprints of the Tales from the Crypt, in between attending the Kefauver hearings, William Gaines was writing editorials in his comic books, and he did a call to action, and in the I think it was the January 1954 issue of Tales of the Crypt and his other titles, he did a call to action, an appeal for action. And it's time, he says, for the majority's voice to be heard. It's time that the Senate subcommittee hears from you, each and every one of you. And he talks about, wherever you can, let your voice and the voices of your parents be raised in protest against the campaign against comic books.
They got thousands of letters.
It's incredible. And I just want to just a little bit of humor here. After the hearings were over, And when it became clear that they had lost the battle against crime comics, and just before the beginnings of the Comics Code Authority, Frederic Wertham had he had an entire page called In Memoriam, and he basically did a I guess I can maybe change this up here a bit. Anyways, it's called In Memoriam inside the comic book, and it's a gravestone for all of the comic books. You know, Tales from the Crypt, born in January 1950, died November 1954. So in October, November of 1954, crime suspense stories, shock suspense stories, Haunt of Fear, Vault of Horror, they were all canceled. And it's funny. He said. He was so angry. He actually said it's in the comic book. He goes, naturally, with comic book magazine censorship now a reality, we at EC look forward to an immediate drop in the crime and juvenile delinquency rate of the United States. We trust that there will now be fewer robberies, fewer murders, and fewer rapes, thanks to the fact that we no longer have crime comics. So he has a lot.
The thing to realize is the crime statistics went up all the way till the 90s, where now they've greatly decreased, to all-time lows.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting because I look at the pattern. When I look at the pattern of what was established from crime comics, and one of the things you said your thesis was about was looking at I think you even said at one time that it's the story of America in many ways, and
yeah,
and what I see is, if you look at the pattern now, if you look at the current comic culture war now, and I know it's sort of ebbs and flows, right? But if you look at what happened with crime comics, you started off with this idea of, overprotection. You want to protect something, you cherish something, so you want to overprotect it, and that's the children. That leads to a perception of harm being done by these comics. And then what do you do when you're a parent and you can't protect your children? You look to big government. Can government help you? I can't protect my children. Let big government step in. Government steps in, but they realize they can't parent children, right? And so they step back, and then that leads to self-regulation, that leads to censorship. And that's what happened. In today's world, to draw an analogy, what's happening today is that we're getting the virtue signaling followed by the perception of the harm. We get government involvement sometimes, but they want to step back. And then we get social stigma and the censorship and the silencing of voices online. So we see similar patterns playing out decades apart, and the same sort of reactions. The intellectuals are stepping back and saying, well, we got to, it's freedom of expression. We can't really get involved. But then what do people do? Just like they did in the 1950s, the Constitution wasn't really available to them to help get rid of these crime comics. So they rely on social stigma, putting the retailer down, putting pressure on them. And what do they do now? They do the same thing now. Freedom of expression. Well, we can't, the First Amendment, we can't destroy it. So, you virtue signal, you create this perception that everyone needs to be protected. And then you stigmatize them online. It's a pattern.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I want to point out too is I just remembered this point, and it's a very important one. So the comic industry likes to, use Frederic Wertham as like a boogeyman. And a lot of writers have pointed out that there's no other figure really like Frederic Wertham in other industries of media, not in movies, TV, that sort of thing. Mm. So they blame him as ruining the comic book industry, but there's actually more things that have to do with it. So there's is there 3 or 4? I want to read them out real quick. So the first one is the anti-comics crusade, which is the Frederic Wertham argument. The second one is in 1955, which a year after the hearings, American News Company, which distributed the majority of periodicals around the United States, was broken up by antitrust action. And I guess I heard from somebody, this was in conversation though, not in any sort of like of my reading. So I'd have to do more to find that out. But it might have also been mob connected, which isn't very surprising because lots of stuff is mob connected. So the third one is Americans were getting televisions. Like you said, there was a vast amount of wealth, in Canada and America after the war period. And the television was invented. People were getting it into their homes and they were watching, Howdy Doody and all these other TV shows that were on. So there was less time to spend on comic books. And those three things are seen as the trifecta that really sort of hurt the industry for a while.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, though, another thing that there was actually, not only was the Comics Code Authority a role, but there was a very strong New York City bylaws. There was actually a New York City bylaw which really curbed a lot of the publication of it. And it really harmed the Canadian comic book market because we got our plates for our printing presses from New York. And that for basically that put a kibosh on that when the New York City bylaws came into effect. And in 1950, at the onset of the Korean War, we had our international regulations regarding trade with the U.S. Long story short, it basically resulted in during the war, the Canadian market was shut off from American comic books for about 4 years, and that led to a rise of a lot of Canadian publishers. When that came down, we were inundated with American comic books, and so that's why all the Canadian publishers went to the wayside, and that's also when a lot of our groups. That's why we had a lot of anger in the early 1950s, because we thought we dealt with it in 1949, but then there was a change in the law, and our market was inundated with American crime comics, and so that's why the problem with crime comics arose again even after 1949. But interesting history, man. Interesting history.
Yeah, it's really, and I find it interesting, because. First off, we're both historians, I have a family, and I don't know if I would have really enjoyed the history of this, like in my 20s or something. Yeah. But now it's sort of like it resonates because, you have a family and you want to understand life, and that's kind of, what this all is. There's tons of arguments. And ultimately, most people are trying to figure out what's the best way to live, and so it's really, really good. You can get in there deep and, contemplate all these arguments.
Yeah. And one of the things that really, I was just going to say the incredible thing about that I saw was so different in Canada, which really surprised me, was the fact that we actually made crime comics almost an absolute liability offense. That
it's like, how are you going to do any story then? Because you can't do any story with a crime, essentially.
Well, and in fact, that's one of the things that was even addressed in I think it was in the Stanford Law Review article, where it said that they were afraid to create that legislation because it might prevent legitimate stories that schools actually teach the children from. It might forbid a lot of novelizations. People could complain about all kinds of different books, not just comic books, and it's very, very difficult to narrow it down like that. And it's just a complete quagmire. So, I mean, but the thing is, even talking about doing that, and you saw, Senator Kefauver, he did it. Senator Fulton in Canada here in our Parliament, he did the same thing. They all talked a big game. They were going to do this, they could try that. But like you said, they all had ulterior motives. They all had ulterior
Mm-hmm.
motives, and at the end of the day, they just, it would get them reelected, right? And
Yeah, it's all about re-election with politicians.
yeah,
They
well,
might care about your issue, but more than likely, it's just something to be seen for your constituents.
yeah.
I'm representing you. Look at me work hard. That's essentially what it's always about.
It's funny, and it was on. I think it was. I forget the exact day in December 1948. After our Canadian Senate had passed the crime bill, and created Section 207 of the Criminal Code, making crime comics illegal. Senator Fulton left the Parliament buildings, and he walks down the street of Ottawa, and him and a bunch of children, took part in gathered all those comic books and had a nice, good old-fashioned burning of the comic books, and nice big picture,
Yeah.
the cover of the Ottawa Citizen. Senator Fulton sitting there pointing to all these crime comics that are poisoning the minds of Canadian youth. It was like I say, it was good PR. It was good PR at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
but at the end of the day, isn't it interesting that as much as judges were calling for it in Canada, they wanted crime comics dealt with. It's very interesting that no attorneys general, at the end of the day, intelligence prevailed, common sense prevailed. Yeah. Lawyers looked at this and said, we can't successfully prosecute this. And if you want to know, this is very interesting. Despite all the hysteria in Canada about it, the grounds that the two major cases in Canada, they were both thrown out of court for on the grounds of duplicity. Now, if you want to know what duplicity is, I can't believe that this defense worked. This was the defense that the publishers used and the retailer used, and it was successful and it worked. Their argument was that what happened is that the Crown prosecutors, they saw all these crime comics, and so what they did was that they, instead of charging the publisher, like if they saw 100 crime comics, they just charged the publisher once, because the Crown prosecutor thought, well, I'm not going to charge him 100 times for each comic. I'm just going to charge him once. There's 100 comics, so there was just one offense, and so and that's what they did pretty much across Canada. Well, they were all thrown out on grounds of duplicity because the defense was, well, there's like 100 comics here. Which comic book was the offending comic? There was 100 of them. Which one was it? You only charged them once. Which comic was it? And they said, well, it's all of them. And the publisher was saying, it can't be all of them. Surely it can't be all of them. And the judge agreed. It was like void for vagueness. Like, what are you talking about? There's all these comics. Well, where's the underlying offense?
It makes sense too. It's a great defense.
Yeah, and anyways, they were struck on. Now, to be clear, it was struck on that's a purely technical defense, by the way. It had nothing to do with the merit. It had nothing to do with because it's an absolute liability offense. I mean, let's put it this way: in lawyer circles, you got to be pretty stupid as a Crown prosecutor not to successfully convict on an absolute liability offense. Okay, I mean, it's pretty easy to prove because the defenses are limited. So the only way to defend yourself is a technical defense. But yet the judges found a way to dismiss some of these charges against publishers, and this was at the height of the hysteria. So that's very interesting. There was a disconnect between members of the judiciary in certain levels of court and the media. And guess what? Nobody cared. Canadians didn't care. And the attorneys generals didn't care. It never got a lot of attention when these things were thrown out. I couldn't find a single newspaper indicating that these things had been thrown out. It was
they only talked about it when it was like pumping the hysteria.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What I find interesting is you talk about, like the peak for you guys was the 1948-49 or so.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's when America's movement really started ramping up.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there was like a play between the two that was like affecting each other.
There was. And I'll tell you exactly.
Like a rub. Like, oh, it's starting to get big here. Let's get it big here. I don't know if the thing is all the literature I've read is all American centric. So I'm not familiar with the Canada movement at all, but I wonder if it was like, if it had any connection whatsoever, or if, if it did, whether it was like unintentioned or, there was people actually coordinating stuff.
As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why it was the provision was successful in getting through, one of the conclusions made at our Senate hearings in Canada was that, and this is something that Senator Fulton, Canadian Senator Fulton, did not mention when he was testifying at the American hearing, is that one of the reasons it passed in Canada is because we blame the Americans for shipping their foreign trash to our country. And by
everybody thinks American culture is trash.
Exactly. It was the comic books we were calling foreign trash, because what happened is that there was a change. There was a change in our trade. There was an amendment, a revision in our trade agreements. And when we got that influx of crime comics from the United States, that created a nightmare for us, because then all the parent-teacher groups are going crazy. Parents were getting all upset. MPs were crying foul, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the United States publishers. And one of the reasons why we never went directly after publishers is that we couldn't, because they were all American publishers, and it was being shipped into Canada. And we didn't want to stop the shipment of the comics into Canada, because comic books also fell under the category of literature, and we would have prevented the shipping of library books as well. So we couldn't do that. And so this led to a problem. So, they kept it under wraps. And I should also say that the Kefauver hearings in the U.S. were, I believe they were on radio, and they were even televised at some.
Yeah, 86%. Here's what's interesting. I almost bet you, if you took a poll of how many people watched the impeachment, it's very, very low, I suspect. Now, when you take in, this was going on at the same time as the McCarthy hearings, they said that 86% of America tuned into those hearings.
Incredible.
So that's like the majority of people were watching the McCarthy hearings because it was interesting, and the juvenile delinquency hearings. Also, one thing to point out, though, is there's only like 2 or 3 channels. So you only had a small selection.
Yeah. No, and just to be clear, the Canadian Senate hearings, they were in private. I had to go to the archives to get this. This is not something, we never had them. They weren't televised in Canada. They were just, reporters went there and reported on it. But the actual transcripts, it's actually quite interesting. There was one particular senator was a failed cartoonist, and he was accused of having a bias because he failed in the comic book industry himself, because he was a failed cartoonist. And there was a couple of senators that thought that it was absolutely wrong, that they thought it was a joke, that crime comics, there's nothing wrong with comic books. They're barking up the wrong tree. And it was interesting to say the very least. And it really gets, they had a huge argument. There was only one province in Canada, 10 provinces at the time, still 10 provinces, 3 territories. Anyway, the only province in Canada at the time that thought maybe it was going too far was Ontario. Ontario questioned. Ontario was the only province to say, well, do crime comics actually cause juvenile delinquency? The worst province in Canada for it was, for some reason, Saskatchewan really wanted to clamp down on crime comics, which is interesting because I didn't think they were shipped a lot of crime comics, but it is what it is. But yeah, interesting.
What's interesting was you said you talked about the archives. At the American archives, you can see a lot of different stuff. They have letters that people obviously wrote to the Senate and Congress.
Cool.
Frederic Wertham, after he passed away, his wife took all his materials regarding this, notes for the book and all that stuff, and turned it over to Congress as well. And they actually have it, and there are a few individuals that have gone over his notes and used it in their work. which I think is very interesting. I mean, I hope someday that maybe I can go and take a look at those as well. I don't know what I would use it for, but it's very cool, you know, I guess is the best word to describe it.
Yeah. And one of the things I think, you know, Frederic Wertham is a very, he's actually a more complex individual than we've talked about. And I know you've done more readings on this particular aspect than I have, but Frederic Wertham he was very highly respected. He did actually have he has a very good lasting legacy. He actually did help a lot of people. He actually did end up toward the end of his life. He did change his view of comic books, and
slightly. He more liked fanzines,
right?
Because he felt like communication between people was the most important thing. Because he didn't like violence, and studying history, you don't want like a historical view. He felt that you could tell the story of history through violence, and that because we emphasize violence in our media, that we condoned violence, which I think is silly, but that's what he believed. And so you really understand like his worldview when you see that. I think a perfect way to explain it is like watch the Joker film, and especially that last scene. Like that really is how he would hate that movie because it's so violent. Yeah. But I think he would love the message of the movie.
Yeah, no, yeah, that actually makes his case for him, yeah, because it's about a psychopath. Yes, exactly, and based on a comic book character to top it off.
Well, and here's what he says: the Joker at the end of the film, which is why I don't really like, I don't like that movie because the overall message, I don't really like it that much, but it's a really interesting film. He goes, you know, society made this way, you guys did this, you know, and blah, blah, blah. You know, he's blaming it all on everybody else. And that's exactly what Frederic Wertham says. We need to protect these children, you know, and that's how he's saying it. You know, it's really rather interesting.
Yeah, and it should be noted here that I would encourage anyone who is watching this at whatever point to Google the Comics Code Authority and actually look to see what some of the rules and regulations of the Comics Code Authority are. Because the original draft of the Comics Code, the Code of the Comic Magazine Association of America Incorporated, abbreviated as Comics Code Authority, if you look at some of the rules that they had and guidelines they have, they are as a direct response to the criticism of the comic books themselves. And some of them here are just, I'm going to read a couple of them. Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. If a crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. Ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible. Suggestive or salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities.
Where do you hear that?
Exactly.
I don't think I've ever heard that one before.
No. Well, you know, and it's cool because, you know, we spoke earlier about how we have this hype, this overreaction, and then they get what they want. They get the Comics Code Authority, and in Canada here, they even got a criminal code edition, and yet they don't really enforce it. They don't really enforce it.
Here's the thing. There was two things that I got out of that, though, while you were reading it. Like a bunch of those were directly targeting EC Comics, which a great book to read for that is this one called Race, Shock, and Social Protest. Very good book. Check it out. Anyways, number two, what if there's like a great story of a crime that is unjust on the law books, you can't tell that story without those laws, with those rules.
That's exactly
That's the reason why rules in literature should be broken, you know?
Yeah. Well, and even there's also hypocrisy there, because it's interesting that the Comics Code Authority, ironically enough, talked about not depicting things in a racist manner. And yet of course, this is still racist America. I mean, America was still, you know,
there was still segregation going on.
Jim Crow laws. I mean, all that was still there. I mean, and so it's interesting. And I remember that story that William Gaines always tells, and it's a very famous comic book story. And he tells a story.
The whipping.
Well, the one where the astronaut goes to, you don't know the astronaut takes off his mask, and it's a black man. At the final panel, it shows it's a black man, and then the Comics Code Authority wanted him to make it a white man because they didn't want to make it look like some future educated person would be black. They wanted it, and so clearly there's, even with the Comics Code Authority, it didn't make America more or less racist, quite frankly.
Yeah.
You know? And so it didn't, you know, the racism was still there, and it just goes to show you that if you have a racist country, it doesn't matter what kind of a Comics Code Authority you have, it's going to find a way to perpetuate it. And that's just the reality.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. The thing to realize too is Frederic Wertham, he was very anti-racist. Like, I mean, we talked about the segregation. He had a hospital to help children in Harlem, New York, of all places. And it's really interesting. People really straw man his argument because it is fairly complex, even though I don't agree with it. He would say these children don't know how to read, but they can understand some words. So he would use the whipping, which is an anti-racist story done by EC Comics. Basically, the Klan is coming after like a Mexican or a Hispanic, and it uses a bunch of racial epithets in the story. 14-page story. It's basically like, I would compare. I haven't seen people compare it to this, but it's like Huckleberry Finn. Where it says, the infamous word like tons of time in the book, and it's like, how do you weigh something that's worthy? You have this bad word that you're not supposed to use, but it's giving a good message.
Yeah. And
I mean, I can see both sides of it. I wouldn't choose, necessarily Huckleberry Finn for a child to read, to understand that you shouldn't be racist, probably because, there's a shorter version and one without, using that word over and over again to illustrate the point. So, I can see that, but still, censorship's bad,
Yeah, no. And, you said before, one of the themes of what we're going to talk about is how it's the story of America. And I think Canada, I think in many ways, Canada, it's the same experience. And that is that, look, there's that old expression, never let a good controversy go to waste. And so, if you can benefit from it, then take advantage of it. And, you see it, this was the first time coming out of, post World War II America, it was, a very materialistic time, and, people were paranoid. And nowadays, people who think it can't happen again, I don't think, probably weren't paying attention to the comic book culture in the last 3 or 4 years. It's happened, and it continues to happen. Just because we don't have Senate hearings on it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. We had Senate hearings on rap music, didn't we? Or even on the video game industry, did we not?
Probably. I'm not 100%. I guarantee you there have been. I remember I bought a PlayStation 2 because there was talk about making Grand Theft Auto illegal to purchase, which as a child I should have known. As a child, I didn't know any better, but nowadays I'd be like, oh, that's BS. They're not going to do that. Yeah. But I guarantee you that shot Grand Theft Auto 3's sales through the roof.
Yeah, and you got to wonder, because when you play Grand Theft Auto, and you see that at one time, and I'm not an expert on Grand Theft Auto. I heard that it can be very violent, and there's prostitution.
Yeah, you can actually, like, one thing you can do is you can go and pick up a prostitute. Yeah. It shows the business, like the car by bouncing up and down, and then when she leaves, you can get out of the car and shoot her and take the money back.
Yeah, well, if that isn't, I guess that's the modern day crime comic, to say the least. And you got to wonder that, wow. And obviously, if there's no empirical evidence to suggest that children who play video games, go out and want to, buy a hooker and then shoot her in the head. I mean, it really makes you wonder. And I don't know, because part of me is,
it's a parenting thing. Like, really, you can have your child do all kinds of things, but if you're with them and teaching them the real good morals in life, more than likely they're probably going to come out okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you would agree with that.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I totally agree with that. You gotta. It all comes down to good parenting. I mean, frankly, juvenile delinquency or youth crime or whatever you want to call it. I mean, let's face it. If you're an orphan and you don't have a good parental upbringing, you're more likely probably to be on the the worst side of the tracks, or you're more likely to engage in criminal activity maybe than you were if you're raised right. And frankly, if you're really, really bored as a kid and you got no video games, you're probably going to read comic books. Video games come along and then they're the new scapegoat. Everything is about society is notorious. And I think parents, we all are, we all like, none of us really like personal accountability. I mean, look, I don't like admitting when I'm wrong. It really sucks, right? If I do something and my suffering is self-inflicted, well, it's really kind of hard for me I would love to blame somebody else, but the thing is, in the 1950s with comic books, I mean, they were everywhere. I mean, and it was such an easy thing to blame on. My kid would never hold up my kid doesn't beat up other kids. Where would you get an idea like that? Meanwhile, you're staring at 15 crime comics on the floor. I mean, and then you go to church on Sunday and you tell your pastor, look what these, comics made my child do. I mean, you can see it. You can see it.
Yeah. Well, and here's one thing that I've kind of seen discussed, but it's really not a major theme. For most of society, we really never had that much leisure time. You're farming, you're, usually trying to stay alive.
That's a good point.
And with the Industrial Revolution coming into the late 1800s and 1900s, children and people in general had more leisure time to sit around, contemplate stuff, and it probably did increase crime for a little bit. But, because people, especially children, they get some time on their hands, they're going to get into mischief.
Yeah.
But overall, it's probably been very good for people. But the reason I bring this up is the intellectuals saw this, they knew this, and they were trying to figure out, exactly what good stuff to give children to encourage them. Because it's the Plato idea where how do you get the philosophical king? You give him good stuff that will always, make him think in a moral way, and he'll be able to lead people correctly. And so if you do this with children, you can make your society better, is kind of like the idea. Which then, the last point I'll make on this, if you never give them anything that's the opposite, then how do they know what is the opposite,
That's true.
So, it's very complex. I mean,
and it's funny because the irony and the sad irony is that you talk about opposites. Well, the opposite of a crime comic could be said to be an educational comic, and
which didn't sell very well.
Well, that's just it. But interestingly enough, EC Gaines, when he created EC Comics, it was actually half of it were educational comics book. It would actually the
Christian comics.
He started off making educational comic books, and he also had other, the horror comics and what have you. But the educational comics just never sold that much. But he actually got awards, and you can find articles that compliment him as a publisher for publishing the educational comics early on. But then, of course, as particularly once the war ended, more pulp became more common. Then 650 titles a month, comic books were exploding. I mean, people were looking. There was very competitive, and if you're a kid and you're seeing 600 comic books on a New York newsstand, are you going to pick up the educational comic? Or are you going to pick up crime suspense story
flying in the air and stuff? Exactly. I thought what was an interesting anecdote. I think it was in the Plague one. You can probably let me know. They talk about E.C. Gaines and how big of an a-hole he was. And they're like, I can't believe he publishes, Christian comic books, but he acts like that. And all I thought about that was, as a Christian, I was like, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. He's using this guy, to get his message out there, even though they weren't selling very well. But it's really a wealth of knowledge to get out of this subject, though. And you can keep, getting into all kinds of stuff because it was a huge, huge topic.
Yeah, I'm gonna read a quote from Jules Pfeiffer from the book, The Great Comic Book Heroes. He says that charges that the comics were in general a corrupting influence, glorifying crime and depravity, can only, in all fairness, be answered. But of course, why else read them?
Oh, I forgot about this. I'll get my so here. This really sums up a lot of how Frederic Wertham thought. This is the first page 2 of Seduction of the Innocent. And he starts off by using gardening. So he says, gardening consists largely in protecting plants from blight and weeds. And the same is true of attending to the growth of children. If a plant fails to grow properly because attacked by a pest, only a poor gardener would look for the cause in that plant alone. The gardener will think immediately in terms of general precaution and spray the whole field. But the children, we act like the bad gardener. We often fail to carry out elementary preventative measures. We look for the causes in the individual child. The whole high-sounding terminology has been put to use for that purpose, bristling with deep emotional disorders, profound psychogenic features, and hidden motives baffling their complexity. And children, they're arbitrarily classified, usually after the event of the abnormal, unstable, or predisposed words that often fit their environment. Better they fit the children. Oh, and here's this question. The question is, can we help the plant without attending to the garden? Which I think you do look at the individual plant when you're assessing what's going on, as well as the entire field, buddy. So, you have to do both. I think he would agree with that, but overall, you can see very well how he's good at rhetoric and arguments because, that's a pretty robust argument right there. And I really enjoy how he outright tells you what he believes and says, debunk me,
Yeah.
That's what I really enjoy about his book.
Yeah. He obviously, I can't remember actually hearing him. It's been a long time since I listened to those hearings, probably 20 years, but he must have been a very provocative speaker because
he spoke at murder trials a lot as a psychiatrist, whether he defended people and also was brought in to testify against them as well.
That's interesting. Sorry, I'm just gonna. I just wanted to put.
So he had a very good public speaking voice, and he understood all that sort of stuff. I think he liked being in the limelight too. So the biggest thing that's interesting with to me with him is if he had not gone with the anti-comics movement, he would probably be seen as like this big hero.
Yeah.
But because of Seduction of the Innocent, the testifying hearings, his legacy is completely ruined. He's seen as this evil guy to a lot of people. So it's really interesting to me considering him. He's very, very complex, I think, in that manner.
Well, yeah, but he did, I think it's unfair to, it is unfair to judge Frederic Wertham based upon what he said in that 3 or 4 year block period of time. But the reality is he did say some pretty outrageous things. And he said
I think a lot of that is his overplaying stuff. Like you mentioned the Hitler thing earlier. Yeah. I actually laughed out loud the first time I read that.
Well, I mean, it goes beyond that. It goes, he said crime comics were anti-educational in the sense of a child's mental health. He said that youths could not learn about any normal aspect of sex, love, or life in a crime comic. What they did learn, he said, was harmful. He pointed to overly graphic images of violence, sexism, and immorality. He even had a diagram that he took out of a comic book with arrows pointing to various parts of the human body that you could hit to achieve maximum pain. It was from a crime comic. And force and violence are romanticized, he said. Trust, loyalty, confidence, solidarity, sympathy, charity, compassion are all ridiculed. In comic books, life is worth nothing. There is no dignity of the human being. And he spoke of the Superman conceit. That superhero comics.
The Superman thing is very important.
Yeah.
I
mean, gave boys and girls the feeling that ruthless go-getting based on physical strength to the power of weapons or machines is the desirable way to behave. He ripped apart. I mean, there wasn't really an aspect. He even criticized the sound effects of comics. He said he criticized the sound effects, saying, boom, bang, boom, all those sound effects, those great big word balloons. He criticized those as well as being harmful to the kids. I mean, he went beyond the pale, I think, in many respects. And for a scientist that ought to have known better, I think that's why it's hard for some people to completely forgive him, given what it resulted in. There's a lot of people that lost their livelihood. Thousands of writers and creative minds lost their livelihood because of it. And, they're not too quick to forgive.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. He should definitely be held to standard and criticized for everything you said. The thing I would say is I find it interesting. If you understand his worldview, you understand how he's making his arguments. And the one book I would say, if you're interested in that, it's by Bart Beatty. It was his dissertation to get his PhD. It's called Critique of Mass Culture, and I think it has Frederic Wertham in the title. Very good book at explaining everything about him. I think it's like 300 or 400 pages. The big thing with him is he felt that, and I don't agree with this obviously, but he felt that American culture was going to lead to fascism. And I don't really understand that argument, but the one thing that I want to bring up that I think he was actually hit the nail on the head. Also, I think a lot of his stuff is good, like parenting advice, but it wouldn't make good legislation.
Right.
That's also.
Yeah.
B, when he talks about the comic book advertisements, I'm trying to find the chapter that it is. Advertising. So it's on page 195. There's a couple things that I want to bring up.
You mean how
If
he
you
hit
have
the nail on the head? How he hit? You said he hit the nail on the head in some respects. Are you talking about the
I
advertising?
think so. Let me look here. So he talks about some of the things that they have dealing with, and this is advertisement stuff. And I think that, you know, advertisements really get into our mind and affect how we think. There's studies that show this. And he was pointing these things out here in the 1950s in regards to like trying to get little girls to buy bras that made themselves look more enhanced, and just talking about how it was degrading their appearance, and just acne creams, and, you know, the weightlifting ads. You all have seen those.
Sure.
He talks about all that stuff, and I really think that he hit the nail on the head in terms of advertising, but that honestly is a totally different topic.
Yeah.
That probably shouldn't have been in Seduction of the Innocent, but, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah, well, that's a good point about the advertising. I think it's like anything. Whenever you make provocative statements that you can't prove, at some point that's going to overshadow the statements you make that do have some credibility. And I think that's what Frederic Wertham ultimately suffered from, is that, you know, he'll always be remembered for the guy that led to the Comics Code Authority. And although if you're a comic book collector and you have a lot of golden age in comic books, you can thank Frederic Wertham, because it's thanks to him in large part that they're worth so much money. Because when you're burning 600 million comic books, I mean, actually, we don't even know how many comic books were destroyed in America.
Yeah, but Roy Thomas actually said that he went to a book burning and he was the only person that took comic books home.
Really? Who said that?
Roy Thomas.
Oh, really? That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Actually, that's a good point. I would think. I wonder how many kids actually tried to do that. You know, but because
it's really because you've read the Plague book. It is, when you read that chapter where they talk about one or two instances, it is like cultish and very creepy when you read about the flames going 15 feet high, and it's almost like, you know, they're doing God's work or something. You know, it's really, really weird.
No, it is. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut off your head there. I just wanted to quickly show the book, you know, the comic book burning of, you know, this is what kids did in their spare time, apparently, when they're bored. If you can't live stream, you can get together with your friends and burn comic books.
So I was thinking when I read that, I did that joke video a few years ago when they had the Nazi Captain America, where, you know, I shot a Roman candle at it and burned it.
Yeah.
And I burned the America comic. And I thought about that for a while. I was like, was that the right or wrong thing to do? You know, because it really, like, troubled me. I was like, am I wrong here? And I ultimately came to the conclusion that it was a joke. And so it was fine. Because I'm not asking anybody to go burn their comics. It was a joke. And anything's fine when you're joking. You know, even murder.
Yeah. But, you know, I think it's worth talking about, and I guess we did in a sense already, but I wanted to, I always like, and, you know, we are both students of history, and I like to get a lesson from it, you know, and what we can learn from this is, you know, in the current comic book culture war, you know, where we have nowadays in comic books, we've got creative voices from all different types of, all different types of fields, all different types of nationalities. And we now live in a world where there is, you know, let's face it, there's, you know, now people describe themselves by their sexual orientation, by the clothes that they wear, by the music that they listen to, by their medical ailments. We got victimhood, we got everything, and I'm trying to be politically correct as I say all this, and I'm probably not going to do a good job, but you know what I'm getting at in terms of, you know, we now have a we live in a world that wants to recognize all these different types of creative voices. But the danger, as I see, when I look at the experience of America during the Kefauver hearings, is that I think I would just ask people to, if they're thinking of tweeting something or insulting somebody or getting angry at a publisher for maybe letting somebody who has a view that you don't like draw their comic book or to draw their cover, maybe take a sober second thought and just sit back and say, is it really that bad? Is what this person is personally, what this person might view, their personal viewpoints, should that be something that makes you distract from the fact that they might be a talented artist or a talented writer? The fact that they have a point of view, whether it's politically different or on any wide range of topics, do you really want to go there? Because people forget. People forget how bad it was and how rampant and how hype it was during the height of the crime comic hysteria. And it was borderline hysteria at times. And we can't forget about that. And, I think people like to conveniently forget about that. And nobody, there's a lot of people out there being very critical of certain people in certain creative circles because they don't like what their viewpoints are. And I don't like, just because I disagree with somebody doesn't mean I can't respect them as a creative voice. And that's why I'm such a huge proponent of freedom of expression and the First Amendment in the US and in Canada. It's the Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And anyways, I just want to, get your perspective on that. What lessons do you see from this that you apply to your experience and what you see in comic books over the last 5 years?
Well, yeah. I'm seen as a figurehead that, rallied against that stuff. And, the thing that I realized too is things got really heated sometimes, and sometimes they were jokes, and sometimes, people were angry about stuff. Like, I don't know if rallying against, like, for example, Marvel doing bad books and, going to the extent that we did sometimes was the right measure, because what happened is they doubled down on it. And what do you expect them to do at that point? You can say the answer is, do what the fans want. Right. But you have a few channels online that are being critical about it. And you got to realize that these people are like, oh, well, these are the bigots talking, It's really like, I think the biggest thing that I've learned in my studies is like, everyone has their way of thinking. And if you can understand what they're thinking, you have a better way of then maybe communicating with those people. And maybe I'm wrong there. I don't know. But that's kind of what Frederic Wertham, while he was, also being very provocative and, very, trying to take down comic books, was also just saying. But his big message was he loved communication with society. But he did not see comic books for some reason as society communicating with one another. That's what I find weird about that. I don't know. It's very. I think the biggest thing I would take away is don't really look at these things going on Twitter and stuff like that as that big a deal. They're not. Yeah. Like, we have sickness going on. We have corruption going on. We have major things in life going on. I would say, like a lot of people have said, look at your household. Set things straight there. They may already be straight, but they can always be stronger, and you can always, depend more on the people around you and strengthen those relationships, and you'll probably be better off. The stuff going on Twitter, there may be injustices going on, yes. But if those people are then also asking for money, be very wary. That's what I would say.
Yeah. No, that's sound advice. And I think we've covered quite a bit. I know I wrote down some points that I wanted to make, and I've covered them. I just wanted to get a couple things out, and I was particularly interested in your viewpoint of Frederic Wertham, Dr. Frederic Wertham.
Yeah, he's very complicated. Like, I like him overall, even though he says a lot of cringy things.
Well, and also just as a defense of Dr. Frederic Wertham, I think that he also got people. There were many doctors. I shouldn't say many, but there were some voices that disagreed with him. Some professionals, some of his colleagues disagreed with him. And
yeah, Loretta Bender, I mentioned her.
Sure,
but there are a lot like you're talking about, though. I know what you're saying.
So we can't put this all on Dr. Frederic Wertham, because the fact is, I think there was a lot of cognitive dissonance. A lot of people, there was confirmation bias. They intuitively felt that crime comics were corrupting their children, and they like what they heard from Dr. Frederic Wertham. Dr. Frederic Wertham, yeah. He had a PhD, he had a PhD beside his name, so he must know or an MD beside his name. He must know what he's talking about, and that conforms to what I believe about my kids, because if my kids, if they're not being corrupted by crime comics, that means I'm failing as a parent in some way, or maybe my kid's lying to me, and I can't accept that. And it's this whole thing about personal accountability, and I think that's one of the other themes that I think we're talking about here too, is that at the end of the day, crime comics did in fact end up being not that big a deal after all, and same with a lot of the hype going on with Twitter right now. Twitter hype. It's a lot of this stuff isn't really all that big a deal after all. And you made a good point when you said now in the middle of a pandemic, it's amazing how we start to prioritize what is important, and we get our own house in order, as you so aptly put it, that all of us need.
Yeah, it's like the Jordan Peterson argument, get your own house in order. And then you can, and this is a constant theme in people that help people get their life in order. Dave Ramsey, who does, personal finance information. He always says, get your personal finances in order. Then you'll be able to help all kinds of people, So that's a constant thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point. And and on that note, I'll give you, are there any final comments you have, or any other thing you want to talk about? If not, we can, we're on hour and a half here. We can some final comments on your perspective on crime comics and its legacy, the legacy that it has for America.
I guess the one thing I would do is give my pitch on subscribing to my YouTube channel. Basically, I'm going to try in May to start producing some videos regarding different topics. Some of them are going to be, more, your regular media type of information. And some of them are going to be more academic, looking at primary sources and stuff like that. It's going to be a load of fun, because just looking at some articles, I could probably break it up into like 2 or 3 different videos just on the subjects that they're covering. So it's going to be a blast, and I hope that people go and subscribe and get ready for that stuff to come in May, because that's when I'm done with my paper, and summertime is going to be coming out. So, it's going to be great.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to that, and by the looks of things, you might have an awful lot of time to put together a lot of material for us to watch on your channel. So we can all look forward to that. And as far as my final comments, I don't have much more to say other than the fact that thank God for crime comics. I love this hobby, and I certainly am. I've cut back on comics only because it's a pandemic, but there's a lot to love, and I encourage people to check out the history of crime comics. Google Dr. Frederic Wertham. There's YouTube videos on the subject. It's very interesting. If you want to know, there's a lot of people that paid a high price to bring us the entertainment that we read in these floppies every week. And it's a wonderful history. And Cummings, I just want to give you my sincerest thanks for coming on my channel to talk about this. And
well, I mean, I love talking about it. And since you have a law practice and you studied history, there's like two great things that I could pick your brain with. And so it was a pleasure,
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I also want, when you're done your thesis, I would love for you to provide me a copy of it. I'd love to read it when you're done.
Yeah, of course. Oh, I wanted to make one more point. Also, EC Comics failing was not ultimately a horror story or a bad thing, because Gaines went on, made Mad Magazine, and that was a total success.
That's right. Yeah, that was. So we did get that one good thing out of it. And I guess it's Mad Magazine I think it was it 3 or 4 months ago, published their last original material. Now they're just publishing reprint material as of March, I think. Or I think January, February was the last original material for Mad Magazine. So that's, in that way, that's almost the end of a legacy of Mad Magazine for original material wise. But
so it lasted. I mean, that's a long legacy, though.
It is. And the more things change, the more things stay the same. And that's another thing we could, that's one of the things that you could relate to what we're talking about. We think we're so much smarter than our great-grandfathers or great-grandparents. And guess what? We're dealing with the same things, but in a different context. And we're still arguing about the same things. We're just doing it over Twitter or YouTube or what have you. But we're not all that much more smarter than our forefathers, but we try.
Yeah, one point. I got to tell you this. So this goes back even thousands of years, because Socrates, remember, was put to death for corrupting the children.
I thought he drank poison.
Yeah, well, he was forced to drink.
Yeah, I drank what? Yeah, he was put to death for.
So it all comes full circles after thousands and thousands of years.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Jesus was put on the cross for, telling people, just talking to people. Remember this stuff. People get killed over and over again for just wanting to communicate.
Yeah. And it's always that pattern of wanting to protect. The Philistines want to protect the populace from the teachings of Jesus. Everybody wants to protect. It's beware the person that wants to protect you all the time. What is it? And beware if they get the government involved to try to protect you in the form of Senate hearings. What is it Ronald Reagan said? The worst thing that you can ever hear is, "Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help."
And he also gave some good advice here. His big famous quote that I hear a lot nowadays is, "Don't be angry at your liberal friends. They just know so much that is not so." All right, I think that's the perfect quote to head off.
Yeah,
though.
That's right. And well, guys, thank you again. 10-cent Story Cummings, thank you so much, and thank you for all those who will come to watch this. And we will catch you guys later. And Comic Boom out.